Hello, and welcome to the FCC Next Steps podcast. This is an opportunity for us as a pastoral staff to bring to you some content and discipleship teaching that just doesn't really fit on a Sunday morning very well. My name is Jordan, if we haven't met before, and I am the lead pastor of First Christian Church. I really love teaching. However, teaching is not something that I get to do very easily at church just because of the season of life that I'm in right now. I have two young boys, and I already have a couple of other evenings where my family and I are occupied or where I'm already at the church. And so it's difficult for me to get to the church on another evening. So this podcast gives me an opportunity to bring some teaching content to you guys in a format that works for my schedule and maybe that works for your schedule well too. I know a lot of people have a hard time making it to an evening class, particularly if you have kids as well. You get the struggle. But I'm not the only one that's going to contribute to this podcast. Miss Molly, our children's minister, has some content planned as far as childhood, discipleship, parenting. I think she has a few interviews that she's hoping to organize with parents who've been through the trenches raising Christian kids. And so she's going to bring that probably mid to end of March. And then Colin, our youth and worship pastor, he also is working on some content that he's going to be bringing probably in April. And so our goal, our hope is to have at least every other week, hopefully every week, have at least one episode that we can bring to you guys that you can ideally sit down and watch for about 30 minutes. But even if you can't watch and you just listen, we're going to try to organize these in a way that you still get something out of this. So for my contributions, I'm going to start off with a teaching series through Genesis chapter 1. We're going to aim for somewhere between 7 to 10 episodes. And the reason I like to cover this story is because it's, if you give me a second to switch my screen over here, it's a story that we're so familiar with. If you were raised in the church, it's likely one of the first stories that you were introduced to. And because of that and its familiarity, we oftentimes just kind of read it and assume we know everything about it, and we don't really stop to ask really important questions about it. And so in this study, we're going to be diving into specifically just Genesis chapter 1, and we'll make references to other parts of the Bible as well, because what we learn about Genesis 1 helps kind of clarify other aspects and parts of the Old Testament, which can be a very confusing set of books to read and try to understand. And so I want to set the stage here. We are not going to be doing a devotional study through this book. There will be devotional moments because we're interacting with God's Word, but that's not our goal here. Neither is this going to be an apologetics study. Like sometimes a lot of people will come to Genesis 1 and they'll read it through the lens of science and try to answer questions of origins through this. That's not the goal of this study either. I want to specifically engage with the biblical text on biblical terms and do biblical study and analysis. So it's going to be a little more academic at times, and maybe you're familiar with this method of Bible study. Maybe this is brand new to you. This is something I would encourage you to stick out and to experience because it's so beneficial. And what we're going to learn here in the first few episodes, full transparency, I actually recorded several episodes and they just ended up being way too long. And so I'm breaking these down into a little more bite-sized chunks. But what we're going to start learning in these first few episodes is about this idea of context, preparing to read a book. And this is something that applies to any biblical study. We have to understand the context that it was written in. And specifically today, we're going to be talking about the historical context. We're also going to touch on something called cultural context. They have a lot to do with one another. But before we even get into that, why does context matter so much? Well, I want to give you an illustration. If you're watching, you can see on the screen, but if you're just listening, there's a picture on the screen of a football player diving into the end zone. catching a football and a couple of other players from the other team trying to tackle him. It's a really spectacular touchdown catch. And if we don't know anything about this picture, we could look at that and say, yeah, that looks like a really impressive catch. I'm sure that was a really spectacular play. And it is, but that's about as much as we can know about it and as much benefit as we can experience from it. But if we know the context surrounding this photo, it adds layers and dimensions of significance. For instance, this isn't just a picture of random football players. This is a picture of Fernando Mendoza from Indiana catching a football as he dives into the end zone surrounded by players from Miami in what would be the championship game that they're playing. Also important to note is that it's not the last play of the game, but this catch pretty much cemented Indiana's victory over Miami to win that championship game. And it's a spectacular catch, too. And so that kind of adds a dimension to it. Adding even more context to this is Indiana's first ever championship victory in the history of their program. And so that makes this a more significant picture. And even more, adding some personal context to this, Fernando Mendoza's mom suffers from MS. She's currently in a wheelchair in the stands watching her baby boy make what is essentially the game-winning touchdown, screaming her lungs out. Like, this is a really special moment. So understanding all of the background, the context surrounding this photo, just adds layers and dimensions of meaning and importance to it. And the same thing is true when it comes to Bible study. Sometimes we're tempted to just read a biblical passage and say, okay, I get what the words on the page mean. That's important. And it is, but when we understand some of the context surrounding it, the background, who wrote this, who it's written to, what's going on, and the occasion for the writing, what about this word or this concept in the context of their culture and how they understood it? When we understand all this background information, it adds layers and dimensions of significance and really brings God's word to life in our lives in a whole new way. So that's the power of context. And like I said, today we're going to focus mainly on something called the historical context. And we're looking primarily at Genesis chapter 1. We're going to touch on really the first 5 books of the Old Testament, though, in something called the Pentateuch. Penta is the word meaning 5, teaching, so the 5 words, the 5 teachings. So who wrote Genesis chapter 1? Well, traditionally, we say Moses wrote this book. And there's some important caveats there. We say traditionally because, honestly, there's no way we can look at it and know with absolute 100% certainty that Moses is responsible for producing this. The books are at least 3,000, 3,500 years old, perhaps. There's no authorship attributed to them in the texts themselves. But the tradition that's been passed down from ancient Jewish times on up to today is that Moses is responsible for these books. Jews accept that, Christians accept that. And so that's what we mean when we say traditionally. Also important to note is, what do we mean when we say Moses wrote these books? What we don't mean is that Moses is the one who put pen to paper, so to speak. We have to remember that these are, again, 3,000, 3,500 years old, and we don't know if Moses even had access to paper, to be honest with you. Remember, if we know the story of Moses and the Israelites, they were traveling out of Egypt, wandering in the wilderness, not a lot of downtime to go to the corner store and buy some papyrus. So we don't know if he had access to that. But even more importantly, we have clues in the text itself that would suggest that there were other contributors to these books. For instance, in the book of Deuteronomy, about 2/3 of the way through or so, Moses dies, but the book keeps going. So obviously, at least one other person was involved in the composition of these books. What most likely we're looking at when we look at the Pentateuch, or these first 5 books, is teaching from Moses that was handed down to the Israelites. For instance, the Ten Commandments, the law. The book of Deuteronomy is largely just a composition of speeches from Moses. What we likely have are the teachings of Moses preserved in the community that have later been recorded. And we even see evidence in the transitions between the books that there is a what we call a redactor, somebody who sort of smoothed or somebody who linked these together in a cohesive way. And that shouldn't give any of us concern to think that there were redactors or that people were rewriting the biblical text in a way that made it easier to understand, because we do that all the time to an extent in our own Bibles. We call them versions. For instance, the New International Version. That is different from the English Standard Version. It's the same text, it's the same tradition, but it's translated in slightly different language. And even in the NIV, we have different iterations of it. We have the NIV 1984. We have the NIV 2011. And I think there was even one before the 84, if I remember. But the English is updated a little bit. It's changed a little bit for readability's sake. And that's within the period of like 30 some odd years. When we're talking about a body of literature that is 3,000 to 3,500 years old at this point, it makes sense that as language develops and changes, that somebody would tweak the language so that the people understand what is being written. We even have evidence of that in the Hebrew language itself. If you can see the page or the screen, you'll notice these tablets here have Hebrew figures on them. Hebrew is what we call a consonantal language. What that means is there were no vowels originally in the Hebrew language. They were just consonants. And you might say to yourself, like, how did people know what word was what? Because sometimes the consonants are the same. And the answer is, in the text, there was a tradition of how to read it. And people knew the tradition. You and I today in our culture, we don't put as much value onto oral tradition, and so we find this harder to appreciate. But in an ancient culture, oral tradition was far more common and respected and widely practiced. And so there was a tradition of how the story was supposed to go and what the words were supposed to mean, and people just knew that. As time went on, however, the tradition became less and less familiar to the people, and scribes came to the conclusion that, hey, we need to find some way to denote what this word is supposed to be, because not everybody knows the tradition anymore. And so they came up with what we call vowel markers. And if you've ever seen, if we were to open up our Hebrew Bibles today, for instance, you've got the consonantal language, but you've also got a series of like dots and dashes and little swoosh things sometimes, either above or below the consonants. Those are vowel markers. Those were added at a later time to help us understand what this word is supposed to be. And so even in the Hebrew language, we've seen a development. So when we say that Moses traditionally wrote the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, what we mean is that all the content originated with Moses. Or at least he's the one that presented it to the Israelites originally, and then it was recorded, probably written down later by other people. And that's important to note when we talk about Genesis chapter 1, because if you're familiar with the story of ancient Israel and where they came from, it doesn't start with Moses. Remember? It really gets kicked off with a guy named Abraham. Well, Abraham lived a long time before Moses had an opportunity to bring these teachings to the Israelites. So, I mean, did Abraham not know the creation story? Did he not know where the world came from? Or we go back even further to Noah. Did Noah not know the creation story? Did he have no idea where the world came from or where it found its origin? We find that highly unlikely. And so what we're probably looking at, and this will become even more clear in the next session where we look at the literary context, what we're looking at in Genesis chapter 1 is probably a story that predates Moses. We don't know how far back, but it existed before Moses. but he includes it in his teaching to the Israelites in order to accomplish the goal he has for the Pentateuch. And we'll talk about what that is in a minute. So Moses is traditionally held to be the author or the teacher, the originator of the story. So who is this story being told to? That's another important question when we're establishing the context, the historical context. Well, it's obviously written to ancient Israel. And we need to clarify that even further, though. What do we mean by ancient Israel? Because there are different phases in Israel's history that can kind of color how we read this story. Well, if Moses is the author, the originator of this text, we need to look at what's going on, what's the situation in Moses' day. We know that Moses, if you're familiar with the story, he was born in Egypt in a time when Israel was enslaved in that land. That Moses was called by God to liberate the Israelites and bring them into the promised land. If you're able to look at the screen, we have a map on it. We have Egypt highlighted in yellow here, the kingdom of Egypt, and we have Israel, which is known as Canaan, highlighted in blue here. And so we have Egypt. We need to understand something about Egypt. Did they worship the God of Israel there? Well, no, like hands down, they didn't. They had their own Egyptian mythology, their own Egyptian religions, their own gods, and so on. And that's actually a big theme in the story of the Exodus is Yahweh overcoming the gods of Egypt. But remember, the Israelites lived in Egypt for 400 years. So for 400 years, they've been surrounded by Egyptian idolatry. For 400 years, they've been surrounded by Egyptian religious practices and Egyptian stories of where the world came from and how the world works the way that it does. After 400 years, you're going to absorb some of that. And then we have to remember, where is Moses leading these people to? We said into Canaan. And if you know anything about Canaan, you know that there were already a lot of people living in Canaan. All of the ites, we call them. The Amorites, the Amalekites, the Hittites, the Canaanites, and so on, all those people groups that the Israelites were supposed to drive out. Well, all of those people had their own respective gods and mythologies and stories and beliefs as well. And Israel was supposed to drive all of those people out, if you remember. They didn't do a very good job, but they were supposed to because the Canaanites were so idolatrous. In fact, they're warned many, many times in the Pentateuch, do not worship the gods of the Canaanites. Do not practice the ways of the Canaanites. Do not marry Canaanite women and bring them into the community because they'll bring their idolatrous gods with them. So idolatry was a big theme in ancient Israelite history. There was idolatry in Egypt, where they came from, and idolatry in Canaan, where they were going. So if we're writing to ancient Israel, who's coming out of idolatry, heading into a land of idolatry, and Moses is writing this, that's all going to play a big role in how we read and understand the Pentateuch and even Genesis chapter 1. So that's a little bit of the historical context there and the setting. And we need to remember that because when we read this book, oftentimes we're tempted to read this story, Genesis 1, in light of our context, a very modern, 21st century, Western, what we call post-Enlightenment context. And because of that, we ask certain questions that the ancient Israelites probably were not asking. We have expectations that the ancient Israelites probably did not hold. We have agendas and so on that Moses likely did not have. There's something else we need to keep in mind too. You'll see that there's this purple kingdom on the map way to the east in a region of Mesopotamia. And we see there are several names there, Akkad, Sumer, Elam. It's not listed here, but this would be the region where Babylon is located. Assyria would be kind of north up here. Ashur is up here. You'll see even further north there are the Hittites and Ugarites from the Ugarit society. All of these people existed at the same time as the Israelites, we have to remember. Israel didn't exist in a vacuum. And they all had their own stories and their mythologies and their explanations of how their gods made the world. And if you're able to see the map, you'll see it clearly. If you can't, I'll describe it. There are these beautifully rendered, highly artistic black lines on this map. That's a lot of sarcasm if you can't see it. These are representative of ancient roads and pathways that merchants would use to trade. Egypt, over in the west, was one of the most powerful and affluent kingdoms in the ancient world. Babylon, located in the Fertile Crescent, was one of the most robust and economically prosperous regions in the ancient world. In fact, many historians and anthropologists believe that civilization really got its start in this region of Mesopotamia. And right in the middle of these two economic powerhouses is the land of Israel. And all of these major trade roads go right through the heart of Israel, which means that not just in its beginning, but throughout its entire existence, Israel is going to be constantly initiated in the ways and the gods and the stories of these idolatrous nations and peoples. There are always going to be merchants coming through. There's always going to be influence from outside cultures coming through. There's always going to be interactions with these other stories. And so it becomes imperative for Israel to have a firm understanding of who God has called them to be, who their God really is, and how the world really works, regardless of how all these other cultures and stories claim and insinuate. All of that's going to become very important as we move into the next session and we look at the literary context. But that's probably enough for today, talking about the historical context. Here's some conclusions that we can draw from today's session. Genesis chapter 1, the creation story, is most appropriately read in light of its historical setting. What we mean by that is ancient Israel dealing with its own identity and the problem of idolatry. It is probably not most appropriate to read it in light of our historical setting, a 21st century Western post-Enlightenment culture that has a very different understanding of the world and asks very different questions of the text. Before we deal with any of that, we have to first deal with the original setting, the original audience, and the original situation. Only then can we hope to uncover what God originally intended to say through these words. So I hope that this has been enlightening and beneficial. We try to keep this as bite-sized as we can because we know not everybody has a ton of time or attention that they can devote to this. But I would encourage you to think about this. Maybe even read through the text once. Genesis chapter 1 shouldn't take you very long, and see if you can make note of maybe how an ancient world really is a better setting for this text and how this story speaks to that situation of Israel trying to identify who God is, who they are, and where all these false narratives of idols fit in this world. That's all for right now. We hope you guys can tune in for the next session where we're going to be dealing with some of the other creation stories that existed during this time that Israel would have been familiar with and had to somehow deal with. And Genesis 1 has a lot to say in light of that as well. We'll see you guys later. Check you out next time. Bye.